Welcome all you wiretappers out there. Back here with, I believe it's episode number 3 in the gargantuan, overarching tale of the Mob and The Teamsters with my good friend Camulus Robinson here, who did a lot of research on this. Cam, welcome.
I'm glad, as always, to be with you, Gary.
Yeah, you are. You want somebody to see your work or hear your work, don't you? There's not much use in doing all this research unless somebody can hear it or learn about it or whatever, read it or however you do it. You kind of do it for your own entertainment, and I do a lot for my own entertainment. Sometimes I go down a rabbit hole, and I know you do too. That I better sit back here where you can see me, folks. I go down a rabbit hole where you can't, I can't really, I don't really ever do anything with it, but I entertain the heck out of myself.
Yeah.
You ever do that, Cam?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we were talking about that earlier, but that's, and I would go, and my wife did not always share my enthusiasm when I would on a thread, so I would let them hook up.
They call you for dinner for about the 4th time, or go do something. Did you ever take care of something for the 4th or 5th time? And you're saying, just a minute, I'm just almost done here.
Solving 4-year-old problems,
I don't guess you've ever done that, have you,
Cam? No, not me. Just don't ask her. Don't ask her.
So here we are, back with the Teamsters. We're talking about Mob moves in. We've kind of got Fitzsimmons has taken over, and Jimmy is in jail. He finally got put to jail. He beat the case, but he bribed the jury to do it, I believe. And then they caught him on the jury tampering. So he's in the penitentiary. He's in was it Lewisburg, wasn't it? With Tony Provenzano or something others. And
Mob Pro.
And if you saw the Irishman, that's where he and Tony Pro kind of had a falling out during that time. So where at that point in time, he is going to get out of prison. They have basically bribed Richard Nixon with $1 million to get him out, but they put a stipulation on it. The union did it. Fitz and some other people with the union and the mob, of course, had to approve of that. Did that because Alan Dorfman was part of that money together. But they put a stipulation there that he couldn't come back in and have it do any Teamsters business. And Jimmy Hoffa, being out of the penitentiary and not being able to help run the Teamsters union, he'd be like a caged lion, wouldn't he?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That was his union, his baby, his creation, and the idea of other people running, it was just apoplectic that somebody else had taken his union. Hoffa had plenty of money. Everything. I mean, he made 10% on every Teamsters loan. You're talking millions, but without his union, it was such a control freak. So that was it.
They probably weren't including him in on any of the action. Now
No.
We know that he was getting kickbacks from Morris Schenker for loans that he made to them, and then Chicago, the outfit, tried to step in on it. We heard that tape where Joey Lombardo threatened Schenker and said, we're in on it. And Schenker says, well, I dealt with Hoffa, and Hoffa didn't tell me about you guys. I didn't know you guys were in it. And he never did pay him any money, by the way. But Dorfman and then Bill Presser, we talked about him out of Cleveland, and they're still, making these loans to Las Vegas casinos and getting kickbacks for doing that. And actually, they got caught, and Dorfman got a year in the penitentiary for taking those kickbacks. He kept his mouth shut and did his time and came out. From 1972, 70 up to 76, that's when the outfit and Lombardo really started working closely together. Joey Lombardo, Joey the Clown, would be over at Dorfman's office almost every day, Cam, talking and shooting the breeze and making sure that Dorfman was doing all the right stuff. And Presser was operating with his mob guy, Macy Rockman, back east or in Cleveland, and they approved a lot of loans during that time. That's, you've got to figure down there of $183 million of loans between 72 and 76. this is before the Alan Glick $62 million loan.
Right. And these were done on yellow notepads. I mean, no formal application, no credit check, and most times no collateral. I mean, you had half the loans, 50 loans were in default, losing $15 million a year in interest payments. I mean, you just show up and they'd write you out something on a piece of paper, and I owe you. I mean,
of course, during this time, some people would say they really built the Las Vegas Strip.
yes.
They couldn't have got those loans to build all those casinos or remodel casinos like, Circus got a big loan to build a big tower and remodel and that kind of thing. As a matter of fact, the Union Plaza, the downtown hotel, it was a huge, big hotel tower downtown, and it was built with, they called it the Union Plaza back then, and it was built all with Teamster money. Wiretaps are all over the place. The FBI is really trying to figure out what these guys are doing, and they started figuring some stuff out here in Kansas City, and figured some other stuff out too. Though this prepaid insurance plan that they got into, that was a big deal. Another way that the Teamsters, we talked about those before. That's one of the early times that Nick Savella, he had a plan. I think I mentioned this before, that first time he threatened Roy Williams, they had a plan that was going to provide these guys with some insurance, some dental insurance, but it really wasn't any good. And they had a scam dentist set up to take it, and it was going to take like $5 from every Teamster every month, which was really, they may not even pay attention to it. And Roy Williams said, but this isn't any good. I mean, we're just ripping these guys off. And Nick Savella had to call him in and have a talk with him and say, no, we are going to do this. So they took that money for a while and continued every scam they could. On a national level, Dorfman and them were coming up with this prepaid insurance that would be, there'd be a lot of fake claims made from doctors that they had in their pocket to get, and they'd get kickbacks from the doctors, and it was they just use it as their own personal piggy bank.
Yeah, absolutely. We had one put together between the Cleveland mobs and the LA mobs were really tight through a guy named Nick Lacotte, I can't remember, but industrial consultants, People's Industrial Consultants. They came up with these great names for things, and really generic names where it really fit in. And they involved Fitzsimmons, and the FBI saw him. They recorded Fitzsimmons meeting with mob figures from Cleveland and Los Angeles at the La Costa Resort, which is built with Teamsters money. That was basically where all the mob guys in San Diego used to play golf. They'd come up from Palm Springs, and they'd come out, and Alan Dorfman was a regular there, and they'd get rub downs and play golf. And that was the Teamsters and Mafia place to play golf. Richard Nixon also played there. And the FBI went and they wanted to put up additional wiretaps because we've got the head of the Teamsters meeting with known mob figures discussing insurance plans. And Nixon's Attorney General, William Kleindienst, on strict orders from Nixon, denied the FBI. He told them, leave it alone. Leave it alone. This is the power that the Teamsters had. The Attorney General of the United States is telling the FBI no wiretaps because they needed their votes and their money.
Right. Yeah, that's the key. That's the key for a mob, is to have control of the union, and then the union be really politically active. That is the deal. And now we're coming into the time of the beginning of the end with the Argent loan. Dorfman and Presser were big into this, and actually Frank Ballesteri, my understanding, was the one that this guy named Alan Glick got introduced to in Las Vegas. There was a guy named Bussieri out there, and all of a sudden I've lost his first name. I don't remember if I talked about this before, but because he ended up getting killed.
And it was Nick Bustieri or something Bustieri. Yeah, I know you're talking about.
He supposedly made this introduction to that Glick's okay and made this introduction to Ballesteri. He goes to Ballesteri, and then Ballesteri goes to, of course, Chicago, or actually went to Cleveland and Kansas City, because they really owned the pension fund at the time. And said, I got this guy, and he's going to let us do whatever we want to do. You know what he did? It was a weird deal. It's in that the Argent file, the court file. He had a note, just a handwritten note drawn up, and Glick promised Frank Ballesteri, actually promised his son, who both of whom were lawyers, that if he ever wanted to get out of the Argent Corporation, he would sell it to them for like $25,000. I mean, it was bizarre. It was like, it wouldn't even make sense. There's no way that could stand up in court. But for some reason, I think maybe that was a test to see if Glick would do whatever they wanted him to do. And the only thing I can figure, he kept Ballesteri's sons on an ongoing retainer of $50,000 a month during this time too. Found paperwork that showed that, and they really weren't doing anything. Just make a few calls back there every once in a while.
Right.
Your in-house counsel call the Ballesteri law firm and get on the phone with them 15 or 20 minutes every month, and they send out a bill for $50,000 and they just pay it. So, I mean, when you got that kind of money flowing around, anybody can be corrupted, I think.
Yeah, and that's totally legitimate money. So that's what, like.
And they just, they said, yeah, for legal fees, and we charge a lot for our legal fees. We're really good, and then they just pay taxes on it. And there's absolutely nothing you can do.
Mm-hmm.
Short of it being part of a great big investigation,
right?
And then trying to get into showing the roots of it. But so that that's where kind of an interesting little story. And I'm sure I've told this before. I tell some of these same stories. Cam, I tell some of these same stories, Cam, over and over again. It seems like, and I forget where I tell them, but I had an FBI agent from out in Las Vegas that was stationed with Milwaukee at the time. And they didn't really know. They knew Ballesteri, but they were not real active. The FBI was just starting to get active on Ballesteri, and they're working at the lower level guys. And this guy, Gary, I've got his book. Now, Gary Magnuson, his book, folks, is Straw Man, which he tells about the founding of Ballesteri. When they first started following Ballesteri around, he talks a lot about Ballesteri, and then he got transferred out to out to Las Vegas, and worked the whole straw man case, which was what we caught him bringing the skim out of the Stardust and the Tropicana. But he said that nobody knew who Frank Rainey was, and he just happened to be following Ballesteri just by himself. That's how you do. You pick up on a guy and say, well, where's he going? And he's, just see where he's going. He follows him, and he was able to stay behind him well enough, and Ballesteri didn't know he was there, and he followed him out to a farm somewhere out in the country, and he met another guy, and he wrote down the license plate number, and they came back to this Frank Rainey, who was on the Central States Teamsters Pension Fund Board. So that was their first contact with that. They didn't even know about him before. So that they started putting that together with Mashi Rockman and Roy Lee Williams, got his direction from Nick Savella, and put together that huge big pension fund loan of $64 million.
Yeah. And that's, and Alan Dorfman, at the time, Chicago wasn't getting a part of that. Their kickback came through Alan Dorfman insuring the four casinos. Alan Dorfman supplied the insurance. His little BS insurance company supplied the insurance for all casinos. So that was how Chicago got their kickback from it.
But they ended up getting into it. That Angelo Leonardo ended up. He became the boss.
Yeah.
In Cleveland during this time. What was the other boss's name?
It was Jack White.
Jack White.
Yeah,
Licavoli died.
Yeah, when the Danny Green was going on.
Right, all that was going on. And Angelo Leonardo kind of got it by default. I don't think he really wanted to be the boss, and he kind of got by default. But then when he got to be the boss, they already were working some kind of narcotics investigation on somebody, and they put it on him. And he got a huge amount of time, and he couldn't do it. And so we got the boss of the Cleveland Mafia, or Cleveland. I don't even know what they call it, the partnership or the combination, maybe, or that's Detroit. It's not the outfit. I can't remember what they call it in Cleveland. Everybody's got
know what they call Cleveland. Yeah, I know.
a
Buffalo's the
name.
arm.
Yeah, Buffalo's the arm.
Just
So they put him in. They were going to put him in jail for a long time. He ended up testifying about all this. I can't remember exactly what he said, but I believe he said that they got in an argument. I know there was an argument, and Chicago called everybody up to have a meet. Kansas City and Milwaukee and Cleveland. What came out of that, Cam?
that was they called him in to sort of mediate the dispute, and Chicago said, yeah, we'll settle it for 25%. So then they after Chicago stepped in, everybody then split it and got a quarter. So Cleveland, Milwaukee, and Kansas, they were splitting it sort of 30% each way, and they were arguing over, I guess, that 3.3% on the back end, because they wanted to equal up the math. I guess the percentages weren't working. Chicago stepped in and said, well, we'll make it an even quarter each way. So after Chicago stepped in and mediated the dispute, everybody ended up with a quarter, and that's how Chicago got into the skim. And they were making the insurance profits off Allendorf's insuring the casinos. And you see a lot of back and forth at this time. Mace Rockman and Angelo Leonardo are going to Chicago pretty often, and a lot of, and as you've mentioned in your shows throughout the years, you have a lot of travel back and forth between Chicago and Kansas City. There was a lot of activity during this time with back and forth and flying, dealing with different Teamsters issues and the skim, because they had to transfer that money. Mace Rockman was usually the guy who did it.
Yeah, they during this time, Hoffa is he's gotten out of jail. Thanks to the big political donation. He's not supposed to get involved in politics, or rather in politics of the union or in the union, but he's really working up to get back into that union at the time. I mean, he's working like hell. He's going all over the country. He's got, he's talking to these mob guys trying to get their support. I think they probably see him as a loose cannon, because they got Frank Fitzsimmons, and he's just doing whatever they want.
Yeah.
And they've got Jackie Pretzer, and they've got Roy Williams, and they've got Frank Rainey up in Milwaukee. And so they pretty well own it now. Back east, Tony Pro is in jail, and he's getting back out about this time. So, and the New York families, he's kind of owned by them, and he would be their representatives, and they're not really too involved with the team.
His brother's filling in for him. He's just not as strong as Tony was, but you still got a Provenzano, just not the stronger one, So you've still got, that even New York is controlling through a Provenzano brother, just not the strong one.
And Hoffa, he definitely will have he'll have the ear of the rank and file. Rank and file will do whatever Hoffa wants, but he's going around trying to get these guys on board to try to get him back in. Now he's got to get work with the government too to get that prohibition overturned. But if he can get the Teamsters to agree, then I think the government would agree too. Don't you imagine?
I think, he thought if he could win an election, then the government would almost have to sort of let him back in.
Right. They don't want to anger all those rank and file Teamsters because they know what's going to happen if he can win an office with the Teamsters, and then he can say, well, folks, guys, I'd like to help you, but the government won't let me. So what do we do now? And they got such a heavy political power that I think it probably would have worked.
There were enough non-mobbed up Teamsters people on the board was pretty heavily mobbed up, but there were enough independent guys who maybe could have voted their own way. Atlanta, Georgia, and places like that had guys who just by location were not necessarily in the mob. And so I think Jimmy was making a lot of inroads to guys like that who were not connected to organized crime, and that was his plan.
So what else did Jimmy do during this time in regards to organized crime and kind of showing his independence?
I think that this is when he reached out to Provenzano. We know that he did that, but he would go on television. You saw a little bit of this in the Irishman, and this is clips like this are true. He's going on TV talking about Fitz is always playing golf, and he's calling news conferences. He's doing a lot of talk shows talking about how the Teamsters are getting so corrupt, and he's hinting around that there is corruption in the Teamsters, and that he's not coming out and saying mafia, but he's saying he's starting to work himself up, and he's getting louder and louder. You know, we've seen him on the Dick Cavett show, and he's not coming out and saying much about the Teamsters, but just his presence is making people worry. He's as he becomes a more public figure with the things that he knows, I think that is worrisome to people as he makes himself more of a public figure, and he'll show up and call a press conference outside the Teamsters building saying, "Oh, Frank Fitzsimmons is not here. He's playing golf." And he talks to his lawyer, Frank Regano, and tries to speak with sort of guys like Carlos Marcello and Traficante, asking if he can maybe they could talk to some of the more traditional bosses, the guys back east and up north. But those public appearances are what really start making people nervous. That's where the public really starts looking at Jimmy Hoffa and wondering, why is this guy that we all know as a union leader, why is he on the outside? Why is he harping on how the leadership now is no good? And that's really what is driving a lot of mobsters.
Yeah, I can only imagine that when he reaches out to Traficante and Marcello, that they really are going to sit up and take notice then. And he's not getting along with their guy, Provenzano. He's trying to patch that up, but he's a loose cannon. I think, as far as they were all concerned, he was a loose cannon because they didn't know he had too much power from the rank and file. They had Fitz, who was their stooge, and then they owned everybody else. And they could not own. Nobody owned Jimmy Hoffa, I don't think. Even the best of times or the worst of times, they did not really own Jimmy Hoffa. If he decided they didn't own him, they didn't own him.
Yeah.
So I could see why they would really be threatened by Hoffa coming back. As we all know, they from the Irishman, and I don't really believe that Frank Sheeran is the one that killed him, but I do believe that that the mob killed him and did something with his body where he would never ever be found, and they knew it would be a huge public relations nightmare if they got caught in that one.
Absolutely.
Which is another reason why I don't think they would bring some guy like Frank Sheeran in there. And you want somebody that's taking the oath, man. You don't want some big old drunken Irishman to come in and be part of that.
Right. That's a fair point. You see, Hoffa's his dialogue begins escalating, and you do see a lot of this back and forth, and he starts having his people in the Teamsters actually make threats. And when he really gets up to talking about if he's going to have his people call in all of the pension loans that are in arrears, and if they don't have the money to pay them off. This really did happen. They commented on it in the Teamsters, but it really was a threat. And he's going to call in all the loans, and whatever can't be paid, the Teamsters are going to take ownership of the casinos, meaning that would really draw a lot of attention, and that was really anathema to what they wanted. I mean, it would be much more difficult to operate, and that was really what was not happening. We also know at this time Hoffa was meeting with a guy named Charles Allen, who was tight with who did know Frank Sheeran, and he had given him over the course of a couple of years, he'd give several $1,000s, $33,000, and he wanted him to kill Bill Presser and Frank Fitzsimmons. There were three other guys. Chucky Allen did testify to this. He couldn't remember who the other guys were. He showed him some pictures, and then cap it all off, on July 10th, 1975, Richard Fitzsimmons, who was Frank's son, and Frank were inside a bar, and they were walking out, and Richard's car blew up, which was, now, there's some theories on this that maybe Jimmy had something to do with it, maybe he didn't, and maybe it was one of those mob plans where we'll make him look, we'll blow up this car because that will be the final nail in his coffin. If the president of the Teamsters car blows up, then the mafia will know that Jimmy's totally out of control. And so that was July 10th, and then throughout this whole time, Jimmy's really paranoid. Because whether he blew up Fitz's car or whether he realized that was a message being sent, if Jimmy didn't blow up Fitz's car, then he knows that they're just setting him up. But July 30th, 1975, he got into Tony Giacaloni's son's Red Mercury at the Marcus Red Fox, and that was it.
Never saw him again.
Right. And that was Tony Giacaloni's son's Red Mercury, as I understand it. I could be wrong.
I believe that's right.
Probably pointed out, but yeah, I think that was the case. But the Giacalonis were supposed to be setting up a sit-down with their cousin by marriage, Tony Provenzano, in Detroit. And Jimmy wanted to try and work this out and maybe plead his case that he actually didn't blow up Fitz's car, but he wanted that local 560 in New Jersey to support him. He really wanted to try and take the presidency back. And whether it's out of desperation or stupidity or whatever, whoever was in that car, he got in, and despite his paranoia, and he drove off to glory.
See, during this time, there's kind of an interesting little side story you dug up about this Eugene Boffa, who was he was owned by Russell Bufalino.
Yeah.
In Buffalo. So what was that story there? It's kind of interesting. They were really supplying non-union drivers, or going around the union supplying drivers through a contract company.
Boffa owned a staffing agency, and he got around the master freight agreement. He would go to the local Teamsters president and say, "Look, man, I'll give you whatever. I'll give you a brand new Lincoln." You see them talking about that in the Frank Sheeran Irishman, yeah. And so he'd give him a car, give him some money, whatever, and then he'd say, "But here's what I want to do. I want to pay your guys less than the master freight agreement." He'd say, "Okay." So we go to the businesses, Jim's Trucking, and say, "Look, if you pay me, I can supply you a bunch of truckers for 75% of what you're currently paying them." I said, "Okay." So Jim's Trucking would fire all their current drivers, then they'd go to Eugene Boffa. Well, the same day, Eugene Boffa would hire all of Jim's old truckers and have them sign a new contract that was paying them 75% of what the master freight agreement was. And they'd go complain to their local chairman, who would say, "Well, no, it's okay because it's a private contract," and blah, 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 whatever BS. And so Eugene Boffa was going around the country doing this. He was giving cars to all these union officials as a bribe to mitigate to get around the master freight agreement and basically screw these truckers. And then he would get kickbacks from the businesses for saving them money on their labor costs. And he could guarantee that there would be no strikes or anything, because he ran the drivers, and if anybody wanted to strike, then part of his stipulation was he would just fire them. So there wouldn't be any strikes. I mean, it was a terrible thing that he was doing. But one of the things that's very interesting is the car that Bufalino and Frank Sheeran drove to Detroit for the wedding was registered to this Eugene Boffa. And in addition, Eugene Boffa's wife had made a $30,000 loan to Sal Bergoglio's wife. And Bergoglio obviously was the number one suspect in the disappearance of Hoffa. And Boffa continued this on. He was eventually sentenced to a long time in prison as was Frank Sheeran, who did this to his own union constituency. He was Boffa. That's that car he got from Eugene Boffa in the movie. He did it because he sold out a bunch of his own union employees, took a kickback from Boffa, and violated the master freight agreement so he could screw a bunch of his Teamsters and let them work for less money than what they were.
Right, and you know the mob was getting a little piece of every one of those contracts too.
He was Russell Buffalino's guy.
And you know that Hoffa would not have allowed that to continue. That he would have killed that goose laying those golden eggs for somebody else. He wouldn't. I'd say that he wouldn't do it himself, maybe, but I like to think not. But he sure was going to kill that golden goose off, and every other golden goose that the mob had going. So they had all kinds of reasons to kill off Jimmy Hoffa, didn't they?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So Jimmy disappears, and Frank Fitzsimmons then becomes the pretty well permanent for the president for life of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. It seems to me like there was no way he was ever going to get out of there as long as he was alive.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, you know, the bombing war that continued in Cleveland, a lot of people didn't realize John Nardi was the leader of the Cleveland Local 410, close to the pressers, and that's what the Cleveland war was basically about. Is Licavoli's men and John Nardi were fighting for control of that Teamsters Local 410, and John Nardi eventually lost, and Licavoli controlled 410 while the pressers controlled their local. But when Bill Presser was getting old and he eventually retired, Jackie Presser, his son, would take over. And that was almost like a mafia thing where he passed the mantle of his Teamsters leadership onto his son. And it was sanctioned by the nation's mafias. He was supposed to take over a role from, it's later, but he had support from Kansas City. They had to get support from Kansas City. And Nick Chavella agreed with Mace Rockman, and they got the Kansas City vote for Jackie Presser to take over Bill Presser's role. And this is, in order for this to happen, he had to get mafia support from around the country in order for Jackie Presser to be put onto the Teamsters board. So that's another example of how that happens is the mob approves somebody to be put on the board will eventually elect the president.
And all this time he was the FBI top echelon informant.
Yes, absolutely.
Crazy, and then he's doing, what was it? He was doing some bunch of no-show jobs. No, he created some fake locals within the Teamsters that were getting Teamsters money and earning money, and the FBI let him do it, he claims. And actually, they ended up, I think, charged a couple of agents being involved with that. Although I think it proved out that they didn't really know that he was doing that. But that's how his name came out of the top echelon informant during that time.
Yes, so he's working with the FBI on one hand, and the Justice Department is coming after him on the other hand, and he's conning the FBI, the Justice Department, and the mafia at the same time. I mean, this Jackie Presser is a damned interesting character. He was really walking a hell of a tightrope. He was so close to the mafia, and he was really back and forth with the FBI. I don't know of any other person who's done exactly what the damage Jackie Presser's done to the mafia, but he was just meeting with these guys on the front lines and back and forth with the FBI. I think he kind of got off on the thrill of it.
Yeah, probably. I think those guys do. I'm sure Lefty Rosenthal did. He thought he was smarter than everybody. So, now on the local level, these guys, this union is totally corrupt, and I know they're seeing it by now. And they started some kind of rebellion. There was some rebellion started in the ranks among the Teamsters. They came up with that thing, Pride, that other guy, and I can't remember his name. He started a magazine called Drive, and he started exposing. He was one of the early ones that exposed the sweetheart deal with Alan Glick and $62 million loan to buy those casinos, and then tell me about this prod.
PROD was the Professional Drivers Council. That's what PROD was. Professional drivers. They started up during the 70s. A lot of these reform groups. There were a lot of members who were unhappy, and you see a lot of these groups. Anthony Three Fingers Casalito in New Jersey got caught up in a bit of a reform movement, maybe incidentally. But when he disappeared, his son eventually took over, and there was a big reform election in the wake of Anthony Casalito's murder. His son became a major. Now they lost, and there were these groups really didn't have much of a chance because the corruption was so entrenched. But the Teamsters for a Democratic Union and PROD, they really were running against for leadership and for presidencies of these Teamsters, and guys like Jackie Presser in Cleveland, and I'm not sure about Kansas City, but there was a real push. Cleveland was really fighting for major reform, and these guys were just pushed down. Jackie Presser was hiring thugs to fight them off, just like in the 30s. I mean, they were beating the hell out of these guys. And it's really in the 70s when this corruption is blowing up, and I guess in the wake of Jimmy Hoffa's death, that a lot of these guys are tired of seeing what's going on and knowing that their money is being misappropriated, and they are trying to stand up for themselves, and they're just facing this wave after wave of corruption and violence. And it was really, the 70s was a bad time for it was all bad times for the Teamsters, but there was a lot of people trying to stand up to them, and they just couldn't get any real traction.
Yeah. So it's during that time that the Labor Department really starts paying a lot more attention to them. I remember they assigned one investigator to the strike force here in Kansas City, and that was his job, was to work with the strike force attorneys, trying to, the FBI would be working on these individual mobsters. This guy was taking all the union information and looking at union records and doing a lot of work on the union without even thinking about the mobsters, to see what was going on and try to put something together. And eventually they'll put it all together. It'll take them several years to do that and take the Teamsters away from all the corrupt influences and kind of reform them, make them have new elections. And so it's they just, these mob guys, they just got too greedy, I think. Everybody got too greedy.
Yeah.
Tony Provenzano, during this time, he's indicted for setting up a $2.3 million loan from another kind of the Utica Teamsters benefit pension fund, not even from the big pension fund. This was a benefit.
Utica's benefit. It's just what kind of thing was going on at the local level. You got and Tony Provenzano had just gotten out of prison in the early 70s, and here he is setting up this huge loan out in Utica, and
crazy.
Yeah, and then he was indicted for that murder of Three Fingers Casalito.
Oh yeah, that's right. So he ends up going to jail. He doesn't really ever come back out, Tony Pro does. And his brother is not really, he's trying to run the unions, but he's not really that whippy, is my understanding.
Right. Sammy Pro takes over of that local 560. But yeah, a couple years out of prison, Tony Provenzano, $2.3 million loan from Utica, and while he's being indicted for that, 1976, he's indicted for the conspiracy to murder Casalito and Bergoglio and another guy, K.O. Königsberg, were responsible for that. So,
well, and the Teamsters you mentioned about that, but it was kind of interesting that setting up those contract companies to then take over all the local drivers, so they can just nix the. They said we're doing away with all union drivers, and we're going to hire this other company to do that, and then they have a better contract with those people. I know in the railroad industry, they've been doing that for a long time. No, my son first got a job with the Burlington Northern, or actually with the Santa Fe, and the UP has done this too, I'm sure. They just hire all non-union, just hire a company to do all the lifts at
Yeah.
the intermodal yards for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly right.
And so I got another friend who works for a big, at the shipping area of a big trucking, big hardware chain. And they fired all their truckers, and then the contractor came in, and then he rehired them. They rehired them all if they wanted to. They didn't have to take them, but they offered them the job to rehire them. Like when then the railroad decided they made a deal with the union, and they were going to put union people back in the hubs to lift all the cans off and on. So then they take the existing non-union contractor employees and then interview them, give them drug tests, and then hire them in as union employees. So that, they were kind of ahead of things. Now all the legitimate companies are doing that. I know a guy that got fired from that, or got laid off. I guess he got a severance package from that hardware company, but they were replaced by a non-union company that had individual contracts with all the new drivers and the new dock workers and things like that. That's become legitimized now.
Yeah, that's a damn good point. That's what I do for a living, and that's exactly you're exactly right, and it's totally legitimate now.
Back then, unions had, this is before Ronnie Reagan busted all the unions. I guess busted the started off with the air traffic controllers unions, but it's just all changed so much, and now we come along, we have a lot of deregulation.
Yeah.
You got a section here about when Jimmy Carter was elected. What was that? What was the deal there with is that when it started getting deregulated?
Yeah, Carter deregulated the trucking bill, and this is where you start seeing them get really involved in the politics with the Senator Howard Cannon. Carter said he supported deregulation of the trucking industry, so shippers could set their own prices, and that would give more power to the shippers. They could set the prices whatever they want, and it really the Teamsters would lose out, and they did lose out, and it really affected competition, and more and more shippers went out of business there as opposed to across the board pricing. So the mob started digging really deep for a lot of political connections to try and stop this bill. And that was how they and in addition, that's where the pension, you get Palmieri stepping in to oversee the pension. The government came in and put the Victor Palmieri company in charge of the pension, basically closing the bank. And the mob gets desperate there to reopen it. So the Teamsters owns a 5.5 acre piece of property in Nevada, and it's right next to a really expensive gated club and sort of a gated community. And Senator Howard Cannon owns property in that, and they're trying to sell this land to be developed. And the residents in this gated community are really nervous. They don't want a bunch of condos or things being built on this land. They think that'll devalue their homes, and it'll be loud, and a lot of they just don't want a bunch of apartments or condos built there. So they make inroads. Roy Lee Williams and Alan Dorff reach out to Senator Cannon and say, listen, he puts in a bid for this land, $1.4 million, and Palmieri turns it down because there's already a bid on it for $1.6 million. Well, the bid that's already on it's from Alan Glick, and so they get Glick to drop his bid, and Cannon still has this $1.4 million bid, and so Roy Lee Williams and Fitz they're working hard to get Palmieri to accept the senator's $1.4 million, and Lombardo and Chevelle are behind the scenes. They're pulling the strings on this deal with this senator, and they're trying to there's some attempted bribes to get him to make the deal, but Palmieri wants $1.6 million. And even with everybody leaning hard on their people and they didn't have control of the pension, you've got Roy Lee Williams on these wiretaps every day. They're pushing and pushing. This is where Roy Lee Williams starts getting a lot of pressure from Chavella about, you've got to take back this pension, and Alan Dorfman's throwing a fit about that nobody's doing anything to help me, and Lombardo and Lombardo is in the office a lot of days, and they're whining and bitching and complaining about the pension, and eventually somebody else comes in and buys this land for $1.6 million. What you really see, though, is how they're also so goddamn greedy that if they had just come out, and so Cannon votes against them and trucking deregulation goes through. If they had just come up with, all these millionaire mobsters had just come up with $200,000 and somehow funneled it to Senator Cannon's bid, he could have gotten the land. He would have supported their and probably gotten some other people, and they could have protected deregulation. But because they were so goddamn greedy and they don't spend money, they just take other people's money. He was stuck at $1.4 million. Palmieri wanted $1.6 million. They got $1.6 million. So.
Interesting. So they did the deregulation.
Yeah.
That really changed the whole trucking industry, didn't it? And the pension fund kind of started going down the tubes. It's already filled with all these bad loans. Anyhow,
a lot of these small local firms that the mobs owned went out of business, so they sort of lost that source of revenue.
So it was about this time, let's see, that Fitzsimmons in a huge amount of trouble. I think he died during this. Didn't he have a heart attack or something during this time?
Yeah, he had lung cancer, and I can't remember if he had a heart attack, but I know he had lung cancer.
Yeah, he died during this time, and that's when Roy Lee Williams then gets put forward by Kansas City to be the new Teamsters president. He's kind of last man standing. Presser is, I don't know if he's been exposed, but he's in a lot of trouble with that, forming those fake unions down in Cleveland, and he may be getting exposed during this time. He certainly is being held as a joint defendant with some FBI agents for a short period of time during this time.
And he didn't have the pull and the sort of the gravitas of Roy Lee Williams. Roy had been in it for much longer, and sort of was a known commodity.
Right. We talked about him before. He was like Hoffa, only he wasn't quite as charismatic, but he was a former Teamster. He was a truck driver himself, so he had a lot of pull with the rank and file, as well as with politicians. He'd rushed elbows with politicians. I've talked to kids of some local politicians, and they talk about going out to Roy Lee Williams' farm for holidays and for picnics and things like this. He was big on entertaining local politicians out there at his farm. And he was, and I think I mentioned this story before, he made big donations, or the Teamsters, local Teamsters did, to a big home for disabled people. And he had made sure some of his Italian friends got some kickbacks, his mafia friends got some kickbacks from that. But he was really active politically, and so he was the, really the only choice they had at the time if they wanted to keep somebody they owned. And during that time, that's when we're working like crazy here in Kansas City to uncover the skim. And when they find the notes from Tuppy Luna, the underboss, why there's $1,500 a month to the rancher. And when they finally got Roy Lee Williams and they turned him, he was the rancher and he was getting $1,500 a month. And that was just out of the Tropicana skim. That wasn't out of the Stardust. I don't know what he got out of that, but that was out of the Tropicana skim. Because if you remember, which confuses everybody, there's two separate streams of skim. One was the Stardust, and those other three casinos that Alan Glick had bought in the Argent Corporation, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and the Marina. That was more like $100,000, $150,000 a month, and that was being divided up 4 ways. And then Tropicana was just going strictly to Kansas City. Kansas City, Nick Sabella was kicking a little bit to IUPA just because he was IUPA, and he was dividing up among his guys in Kansas City. And Roy Lee Williams got $1,500 every month from that. But we don't know what he got out of the Stardust. He was getting a ton out of that Stardust too. He had to, because he was part of that whole $62 million loan to Glick. But let's see, where are we? So
They're going back and forth to Palma Boys Social Club. They went with Tony Salerno and the Genovese to make sure that everybody was going to support Roy Lee Williams. You get a lot of the back and forth, and so they got Tony Salerno, and he said if Chicago's good with him, he's good with him. A lot of that back and forth with IAPA and Tony Salerno.
So there's all kinds of gossip and infighting going on during this time. I see Roy Lee Williams. He's supposed to nominate Jackie Presser as the director of the Central States Conference, and then Alan Dorfman says Chicago hates Presser. If he got the job, they're going to have him killed.
Yeah. They thought he was a rat, and this really
it helped them all along with that Senator Cannon investigation. I remember that he was a deep throat on that.
That was Presser who told everybody who that was. But I love that you see. I think it's interesting you see Fat Tony Salerno interacting with Joey IAPA during this time about the Teamsters is going to be in charge. That's just so damned interesting to me. But so Roy Lee Williams gets the presidency, and Jackie Presser never gets nominated for for his old position as the central. What was it? The president of the Central Conference, director of the Central.
Poor old Roy Lee Williams, he doesn't last very long because they've already made this case on him and Dorfman and Lombardo for attempted bribery of Senator Cannon. I guess if you don't get the bribe to them and you get the conversation about it, they got him for attempted bribery, and they get a ton of time in prison. And that by then, Williams has got cancer, and he does not want to die in jail, I guess, because he agrees to testify. And I don't know if you've ever seen those, you remember those, but he testifies. He's got one foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel. He's got oxygen. He's in a wheelchair, and his voice is weak. But I know Bill Owsley deep briefed him and learned a lot of things, this kind of intelligence kind of things out of Roy Lee Williams. This is all work for years and years. An interesting thing Bill told me about that he got out of Williams was, if you remember, I know we've talked about this, when Lefty Rosenthal brought Alan Glick back to have Nick Sabella scare him because he wasn't letting Lefty do everything that Lefty thought he ought to be able to do. And he convinced Glick to come back to Kansas City, and he met with Nick Sabella. Nick Sabella, they put him in a hotel room, and Nick stayed back in the shadows, and they took a light, or what do you call that, a stand-up light in the room, and shined it directly in his eyes, and Nick Sabella standing outside the cone of light and started threatening him and said, if it was up to me, you wouldn't leave this hotel room alive, and you got to take care of this. You owe me $1 million, $1.5 million. And Glick says, well, I don't know how I'm ever going to pay that back. And he said, well, you've got a man right here, Lefty Rosenthal, that'll take care of that. You just let him take care of that, and we'll be fine. Roy Lee Williams tells a story to Owsley that when he was a younger Teamster here in Kansas City, and that's when Nick came up with this plan to get $5 from every local Teamster for some kind of a supposed health insurance plan, a little extra health insurance plan. And it really was, and Williams said, well, I'd just be screwing my guys over. They get nothing for their $5 a month. And Nick Sabella then had him picked up and brought to a barn somewhere and shined a light in his eyes, just like in the old school Bees movies out of the 50s, shined a light in his eyes and threatened him and threatened his children and threatened to kill him. And so they had that plan going for a little while. It didn't last very long. It was just kind of a little extra piece of action that Nick Sabella figured out how to scam out of the Teamsters, and it didn't really last that long. But that was interesting that Nick Sabella does exactly the same thing 20 or 30 years later.
Hell of a negotiating tactic.
Really?
Is that what eventually brought Chavella down? Was Roy Lee Williams testifying? Because I know he was out of prison when he died, but he was about to go back.
That was all part of it. It's all part of the skimming investigation. It's really hard for people to explain. Sabella wasn't really part of the bribery attempt that
Yeah.
Williams went down, but he was talking about everything. And at the same time, they've gathered all this information on all the skimming efforts, and they're bringing that down. And they've got a couple of storytellers in there, and Joe Augusto was going to be one of them, and he had face-to-face meetings, and they've got a wiretap, an audio of those face-to-face meetings, him telling Nick, him and Carl Thomas telling Nick how they're going to skim from the Tropicana casino, and him giving directions and what to do. So they've got Nick on the casino skim, and would have him on this, but he died before they actually get to trial. So were we okay? Back to Jackie Presser, who has been working with the mob, but also informant to the FBI.
Yeah, an article came out in the Cleveland Plains Drifter saying that Jackie was an informer, and they printed on the front page. And Mace Rockman calls up Tony Salerno, saying, we need to get this taken care of. It's gonna, this is, they didn't know, and Jackie Presser said, "Oh, this is BS." So. Gets Salerno calling up his attorney, and same time Donald Trump's attorney, Roy Cohn, Roy Cohn reached out to people he knew in Cleveland, and the paper printed a retraction and an apology. This is the mob reached out to a Cleveland newspaper.
Really?
Tony Salerno mailed a copy of the retraction and the apology to IUPA in Chicago, because he knew that Chicago didn't like him. So this is another Tony Salerno reaching out. That's a lot of people say, well, Tony Salerno wasn't the boss, but what Tony Salerno was he maintained those relationships. So it wasn't like he was a nobody. He had relationships with people all over the country that Gigante didn't have. So he was an important figure, whatever you want to say about him. He was a necessary member of the Genovese family, and he was, whether he was the one pointing the fingers or not, he was still the guy who was doing the majority of the work. So
interesting. So let me see if I got this right. I've never heard this story before. The main newspaper in Cleveland, the Plains Drifter, gets information that Jackie Presser is a top echelon informant for the FBI, and they print a story about it.
Yep.
We talked about that earlier, how that was coming out because he had this case, and they tried to charge these FBI agents with it, and so they ended up saying, "Okay, dude," if he was trying to drag them into it, and I don't think they were really in it. They were just maybe asleep at the switch. They weren't making any money off of it, and so they threw him to the wolves basically, and probably put the information to the newspaper, and then actually Rockman doesn't really want this information out. For him to then trying to figure out how to get this fixed, because it's damaging his relationships with Chicago. He reaches out to Tony Salerno, and Cleveland always had these closer connections with New York than Chicago. He reaches out to Tony Salerno, who then uses his lawyer, Roy Cohn, Trump's lawyer, of all people.
Exactly.
And he knows somehow he can pull a string at the Cleveland newspaper to get a retraction printed, and then they can use that to send it to IUPA to say, look, he's not really a snitch. That's crazy. I mean, that's way too much power, isn't it? Way too many connections.
That's in the 80s. That's the mob is late 70s, early 80s. It's just insane.
That was kind of their peak. Now, Fat Tony Salerno, he'll end up slowly but surely growing old and decaying and going into senility in the penitentiary down in Springfield with my friend Steve St. John. I used to sit with him and some other guys a lot. So I asked him, I said, well, what did he talk about? He said, he didn't really talk hardly anything. It's like he always had a cigar stuck in his mouth, and he didn't hardly ever talk to anybody. And like when Lefty Ruggiero was there, and who was responsible for, bringing Joe Pistone in and as much as Sonny Black was. And he said, he never hardly gave him all his Lefty, but he did let him sit with him. Lefty always sat with Tony Salerno, but he ended up dying in the penitentiary.
So Cleveland's pushing hard for Presser to be president. Chavella owes them that favor because Cleveland supported Williams. So Mace Rockman and Angelo Leonardo are back and forth to Chicago, and they're talking to Jackie Cerrone and Ieppe. They still don't like Presser. Rockman and Leonardo go to New York, see Salerno, and he says, "All right, I'll call them guys in Chicago and I'll talk to them." And that's I'll call them guys. And so he probably said them. But so
Yeah.
there. So Licavoli goes to prison in 82. That's when Leonardo takes over. Chicago's opinion sort of loses value because Alan Dorfman is shot in 83. So this is where they there's sort of that great turnover of power with when they finally lose the Teamsters altogether, and it transfers back to Tony Salerno. Tony Salerno then has the Teamsters become his with the remnants of the Provenzanos still on the Teamsters board, and you've got Jackie Presser is still, I think, the president. Now, Jackie Presser is working to straighten up the Teamsters, whether you can believe it or not. He is trying to take power away from the mob. He wanted central leadership to support the locals. He didn't think the locals should just support the central leadership. So he supports Ronald Reagan, if you can believe that. And I think he could read the tea leaves and knew Reagan was going to win anyway. So he thought, well, we'll get some help. And so that he was tight with Ronald Reagan. And but 83 was when things really changed. Chavella died on bail. Williams' testimony, a bunch of other things, as you talked about. Angelo Leonardo became a government witness in 1983. That wiped out the Cleveland mob. Patriarcha died in 84. Jerry Angelo is still controlling a guy named William McCarthy. But in 83, it came out that Presser was an informant. And so we also know that Jackie Cerrone flew to New York in 1983 to meet with the Genovese leadership. He was more or less going to say, "I told you so," which ended up being a stupid thing because Jackie heard about this meeting from another Teamster, and he immediately goes to the FBI and says, "Hey, Jackie Cerrone from Chicago was just in New York meeting with Tony Salerno and all the upper ranks of the Genovese crime family." So that was kind of turned around to bite him. But Jackie would die of cancer in 86. William McCarthy from Boston would become president. But Jackie Presser's FBI file drew so much federal attention to the corruption and the Teamsters and the mafia and everything that the Justice Department stepped in 1986 when McCarthy was president, and they formed a RICO case against the Teamsters board. So that basically, it was part of that RICO case is we will strip all of you of your positions, your six-figure salaries, and your multi-million-dollar pensions, or you can let us mediate for a few years, and we are going to determine the rules of this union. So the board signed agreements on election reform. So in 91, when the current officials' jobs all expired, federally appointed election officials oversaw the first general election of the Teamsters. So the board, the mob, would no longer control the president of the Teamsters, and the rank and file would hold secret democratic elections, and the mob, they still own a few locals, but they would no longer control the executive board of the Teamsters, and they were out.
Yeah, they've never got back in. Of course, the Teamsters has changed so much after trucking deregulation has continued to change the trucking industry that there's so many non-union drivers and it's so many owner-operators out there, and railroads started hauling more and more with the development of intermodal freight that the big over-the-road trucking companies just are a mere shadow of their former selves. Like, my son and I invested some money in Yellow Freight, which is kind of interesting. Yellow Freight, you became Yellow IRC, Yellow Roadway Corporation. I think they merged with Roadways, but I invested a couple like $1,000 in their stock because they were depressed, and I figured, well, Yellow Freight, they've been around for years, or yellow, they called it by then, but I just lost every penny of it. It all just disappeared through whatever changes that they went through, and they're still out there as YRC, I believe. But it's just they just don't do what they did. None of those big trucking companies did. All those owner operators, and the price of diesel went up way up, and they weren't making hardly any money. It's still a tough way to make a living. Over the road truck. I mean, they used to be a pretty good job too.
Yeah. Now it's much harder, and the Teamsters don't have near the power they used to, and so it's and the after the McClellan, it really did generate the idea that a lot of unions, because there were multiple unions as part of that McClellan, and I think the idea of unions and corruption has just become almost endemic to a lot of people, and obviously union people know the value of them, but I think a lot of states that don't have unions don't really understand why they're important and just see them as avenues of corruption.
Yeah, I don't know. It just seems like life has changed. It's just like unions are a thing of the past. I don't know. And their unions do help a lot.
Yeah.
The problem is sometimes unions get too much power. And with too much power, you start to get corruption there. And they were the epitome of it. And those poor guys that worked their lives out away for the different trucking companies and were promised this pension by their union. It wasn't really the trucking companies, but it was their own labor union that promised this pension that they put money into, and they made bad loans. And meantime, the trucking companies got smaller and they hired more non-union people. So we don't have new employees coming on to keep paying money into the pension fund, and it just keeps shrinking and shrinking. And so they're going to have a government bailout to really pay what's owed to the guys that are there. And now with this COVID virus thing, and tax base is just gone to hell, and nobody wants to pay taxes anymore. Everybody, all they want is tax cuts. So it's I don't know. I'm glad I'm not dependent on the Teamsters union and put all my life energy into that.
A couple more years.
Time I could have. I thought that would be a good way to make a living, and it was back in the 70s. And would like being kind of free like a truck driver. But I'm glad I never did. I went on the police department, and we have a pretty good solid pension here. It's like the railroad, man. That's a good solid pension fund in it with the railroad.
Yeah, railroad retirement, and now the railroad they're all discontinuing their pensions, but I'm vested in railroad retirement. It's kind of like Social Security, but a little bit different. So.
Yeah, and it'll pay more than Social Security. You have to get a second job like I did, and then work for about another 15 years and paying into Social Security. Then you can draw a little bit of Social Security, but they got that Pension Windfall Act, and they cut you pretty big.
Yeah, it's the government sticks it to you.
So save your money away in that 401k. Or in our case, it was a 403b. That's what I did early on. I started putting, like each raise I got, I would put that raise into the 403b, which is like an IRA or a 401k. And sure, I'm glad I did. I did without a few things probably when I was in my 40s and 50s, but I'm glad I did then. It's paid off. It gives you a little more security when you get old like me. All right, Cam, I think we've done the Teamsters here. Teamsters and the Mafia. It's a prodigious story. It's kind of a long one. I may have to figure out a way to cut this in half. I didn't really try to do that. We kind of got on a roll, and then I didn't think about trying to cut it in half anymore. We'll see.
Yeah, it's a lot of information, but we'll work it out.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I'll go on and relax now. I'm working on my day off here, and so are you.
That's right.
Hey, God, it's a labor of love, huh?
That's right.
All right, Cam. I'll talk to you later. Bye.
All right, we'll talk at you.
Okay. All right, Cam. I don't have anything else here. Let's stop.